Henry, I just wish you enjoyed playing the piano. Then you would finally get at a good spot. We appreciate that. Thank you. Well, today we're going to be in Exodus chapter 1. If you turn there with me, it should be very easy to find. It's the second book of the Bible, right? You can find Genesis. You can find Exodus, and it's the first chapter. We're going to read it as we go through the message today. Now I keep having to look for it. Turn pages. Exodus chapter 1. I love the songs that we sang today, and I hope when you sing the songs, I hope you pay attention to the words that we sing. Okay? Because there's a meaning behind the songs, and we sing them for a reason. And if you've ever paid attention, a lot of Sundays, what we sing connects with the message. I don't know if you ever noticed that. Okay? What's that? Figured it out. Good. Good. What's that? What's that? That's right. Great is thy faithfulness. That's right. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And the connection with the songs today were about the faithfulness of God. And that is, I love all those songs. And my favorite song, maybe not my favorite song in the whole world, but one of my top 3 or 4 songs is Great is Thy Faithfulness. And I love that song because it talks about how awesome and faithful God truly is. And, great is Thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. Right? All I have needed, Thy hand hath provided. Great is Thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. And I love not only songs, I love the history of songs. I don't know if you've ever studied the history of certain songs. And Great is Thy faithfulness was written by Thomas Chisholm in 1925. He was born in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1866. And he became a Christian at the age of 27. And at the age of 36, he went into the ministry, became a pastor. And he was a pastor for 1 whole year. And so because he had health issues, he had to step down. And so the rest of his life, he was a life insurance salesman in New Jersey. So talk about an exciting life, selling life insurance in New Jersey. But as he looked over his life, he still saw the faithfulness of God. And even as an insurance agent, he wrote over 1,200 poems. And 800 of them were published. And this song or poem he wrote, Great is Thy Faithfulness, he wrote that. It was set to music, and it fell into the hands of George Beverly Shea, which some of you may know, sang a lot of the Billy Graham Crusades, and he got a hold of the song, and the rest is history. Well, Thomas Chisholm wrote towards the end of his life, he said, My income has not been large at any time due to impaired health in the earlier years, which has followed me on until now. Although I must not fail to record here the unfailing faithfulness of a covenant-keeping God. So over the course of his life, he looked back and he said, Great is Thy faithfulness. Great is Thy faithfulness. Well, I don't know about you, but I love to be reminded that God is faithful. In good times, God is faithful. In bad times, God is faithful. We can always sing, Great is Thy faithfulness, right? Well, we're going to be reminded of that in our passage today about the faithfulness of God. And that's our focus today. And we're going to begin a new series on the book of Exodus. And I love Exodus, and it brings to mind a lot of stuff. What are some things in Exodus you think about? I didn't hear anything anybody said. Burning bush. What's that? Slavery. Okay. 10 Commandments, right? Moses and the Passover and parting the Red Sea and all those wonderful things. And we're going to look at those over the course of some time. But the focus of Exodus is not all the great events. It's not the great characters. It's not Moses. The focus of Exodus is God. Okay, so we're going to focus on God and how we can experience God. And each week we're going to see something about God we experience each and every day. And every day we experience God's what? Faithfulness. You are listening. Good job. All right, so let's get into look at this here. Let's begin. Let's do it. Verse 1 through 7, Exodus 1. It says, Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household. And here's the names: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number. But Joseph was already in Egypt. And Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied, became exceedingly mighty. So the land was filled with them. So this is what's going on. Exodus is a sequel to Genesis, okay? A lot of movies have sequels. It seems about every movie now has a sequel. And some movies need a sequel, right? Seems like Star Wars, there's 28 of them now, and Lord of the Rings and many other movies. There's some movies they should have just stopped at the first one. Well, Exodus is a great sequel to Genesis. If you remember, towards the end of Genesis, about Joseph, and his brothers hated him, so they did what to him? They sold him into slavery, and he winds up in Egypt. And there's a famine. If you recall the story, he winds up being second only to Pharaoh, okay? And because of the famine, his brothers come, and eventually his whole family comes, okay? And at the time, there was not that many of them. They could all fit in a Greyhound bus, if you will, okay? So they all came over, but in the course of time, they multiplied, and there was a bunch of them. And we're fast-forwarding here about a little over 400 years is where we are as we begin Exodus. And there's about some 2 million of them, okay? So there's a lot of Joseph's family, the Israelites, God's people in the land, and everything is great, right? Joseph was vice president for a time. They had their own land. They had power. They had protection. They could do what they want. Everything was good. And then something changes. Notice in verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war they will also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them, to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. And so there's a new king who arose who didn't know about Joseph. Now, I'm sure he probably read about Joseph in history. He probably learned, he probably asked, why are all these Israelites here? They were there like refugees, right? They were there like immigrants, and there was about 2 million. And so he knew why they were there. He knew the history, and really the text could say that he had no concern about Joseph. It's not that he didn't know about it or what they did. He just really didn't care. His only concern was his own people, because there were so many Israelites, they were afraid that they could rise up and attack against Egypt. There were some 600,000 soldiers, or that could be soldier age of the Israelites, 20 years or older. So that could be a pretty massive army. And so he was concerned. It's like my backyard. I don't know what your backyard or your front yard looks like, but this year I usually just have like one patch of stickers in my backyard. And as long as the girls, they don't like to wear shoes outside, I don't know why, but they love to go out there barefoot. And as long as I kept them away from that one patch of stickers, they could go around wherever they want to. Well, for some reason this year, my yard is especially junky, and there seems to be stickers everywhere. And so I have to carry them because they don't like to wear shoes, so they can get to the trampoline or get to the swing or get to wherever they want to go. And so I'm trying to think about ways, how can I get rid of the stickers? Because they're all over the place. Well, the Israelites became like stickers under the foot of Pharaoh and under the foot of Egypt. They were all over the place. And he was thinking, what can we do, because they're hurting us everywhere we go? So what did he do? He didn't want to wipe them out. He enslaved them, right? Free labor. So that's what he does. He enslaves them. And what is so interesting is, who is he enslaving? These are God's people, right? These are the ones of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Surely, if you're a follower of God, a person of God, you're going to be protected, right? You're going to get an exemption. You're not going to go through hard times. You're not going to be mistreated. No, that's not the case. And so they are enslaved. And if you think about it, Egypt forgot who Joseph was. They forgot what he had done and how God used him. The people probably forgot who they were and what it meant to be a people of God. And they may have felt that God had forgotten about them altogether. You ever felt that way? That maybe you were forgotten, that somebody's forgotten about you, your family's forgotten, they don't care, or somebody's forgotten, your boss has forgotten about what you did at work, or maybe you think, maybe God has forgotten about me. Well, you know, you can feel forgotten, but God is still faithful, right? You may feel forgotten, but God is still faithful. It was a few years ago, there was an ad on television, and it started like this. There was a woman sitting in a car, and she was minding her own business, and suddenly a man comes out of the blue and rips the door open, grabs her, and pulls her out of the car roughly. It looks like he's attacking her, but when the cameras pull back and see the car is actually on fire, and the woman didn't know it, and the man was not attacking her, he was rescuing her. And the ad finishes by saying, you need the bigger picture. Channel 10 News gives you the bigger picture. We know the Israelites didn't have the bigger picture, right? They didn't know what was going on. All they knew was slavery, so they were questioning the faithfulness of God. And maybe for you, you don't have the bigger picture either. You're questioning, is God faithful? You know what? He's never let us down, has he? And He's not going to let us down again. He's always faithful. But notice what continues happens here in verse 11. We read verse 11. Look at verse 12. It says, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied. And the more they spread out, so that they were in dreads of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. So think about a tough life. They were in bondage. They were bitter. They had to deal with these bricks, and it was just an awful way to live. Somebody know that alluvial mud from the Nile was the construction material of choice. Often the walls that circled around the towns were 60 feet high. It is calculated that just one royal construction project required some 24 million bricks. The average worker was required to produce about 3,000 mud bricks per day. The technique is very simple and repetitive. You think your job is boring? Try this. Flatten out mud, draw water from a canal or pool, step in piles of the mud, form the mud with straw to hold it together, form it into a wooden mold, let it dry in the sun for 3 days, come back, flip it over to dry another 3 days, and then it becomes a usable construction brick. 3,000 a day. An ancient Egyptian text describing trade said brick making is the lowest on the totem pole. So just imagine their lives, right? These are the people of God. They are in the mud. They are enslaved. They are doing this day after day after day. And so they feel defeated, right? They're in bondage. Some people, there are still slaves today, aren't there? There are still some countries that have slaves. They are in bondage. There's some slaves in America. It happens sometimes where there's a renegade farmer who catches illegal immigrants and enslaves them for a period. Or they're sex slaves, or there's all sorts of slavery. Maybe people are enslaved to bondage, or slave to debt, or slave to sin, or adultery. And a commentator noted how Egypt represents evil. And that the kingdom of Egypt, everything it stood for, shows what is in opposition to God. That Egypt at the time of the Exodus, they had gods of stone and gold and wood that were worshipped. They had a tyrannical leader, Pharaoh. They oppressed Israelites by murder and enslavement and hatred, and so they focused on material prosperity regardless of how they treated people to get it. They were dependent on magicians and sorcerers and diviners, and they were subject to the wrath of God. And that sounds like a lot today, right? What's going on in our world, what's going on in our country, and people are enslaved to all sorts of things, not of God. I love watching basketball, especially the playoff time. I've been watching the Boston Celtics play the Cleveland Cavaliers. And the Boston Celtics are the number 1 seed. They had the best record in the East. They had home court advantage. And they play the number 2 seed, Cleveland Cavaliers, who, of course, has LeBron James and a few other really good players. Well, the first 2 games, they haven't been much of a game at all if you've watched them, right? The first game, LeBron James took over. It was like a man playing a bunch of little boys. And they whooped the Celtics. And then the second game was even worse. The Celtics had the worst playoff loss at home in history, of their great history. And at one point, Cleveland was up 50 points, okay? So this is a playoff game of the 2 best teams in the East, and the Celtics felt defeated. They felt bullied. They felt like they were in bondage. They were just taken advantage of. Well, there's a lot of people that feel that way, right? Well, even more so, the Israelites felt bullied and defeated and forgotten about. And sometimes we feel that way. You may feel defeated, but God is still faithful. Well, for the Israelites, we see, did things get better or does it get worse right now? Things are about to get worse, right? Because notice what happens. In verse 15, the king of Egypt spoke to Hebrew midwives and said to them, one was named Shiphrah and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you're helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death, but if it's a daughter, then she shall live. So things get worse. Not only are they enslaved, not only in the mud, not only in all this mess, now their precious babies are targeted. So he goes to these midwives and he gives them some special instructions, okay? While they're giving birth, if it's a boy, take care of it, right? It's kind of like partial birth abortion here. And they would usually give birth by squatting, and probably were squatting on 2 stones or 2 bricks. And they're saying, if you're there and you see it's a boy, take care of it. If it's a girl, let her live. This is pretty sinister stuff, right? I mean, I'm thinking about, Hitler, right, and Jews and wiping out millions of Jews. This is awful stuff. taking out their babies. And he didn't want the boys to live because these boys could raise up to be soldiers, right? Or they could, if you took out the boys, what would eventually happen? There was no one around to keep the people going, no one to procreate. And so he'd eventually wipe away all these people, all these stickers under his feet. Well, notice what happens here. In verse 17, the midwives feared God and did not go as the king of Egypt has commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established the households for them. So his plan didn't work. And so what he does now is he ups the ante. The first thing was a private instruction. These midwives are to take care of these boys. Now he makes a public declaration. Now he makes an executive order for the whole land would know. Now he gets more bold because he's so upset. He wants to get rid of these Jews. And so notice what it says in verse 22. The Pharaoh commanded all his people, all of them, saying, every son who was born to you, every son who was born, you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So now he's getting bold, right? The first time he was behind the scenes. It's like he didn't want everybody to know. Just go privately to these midwives and just take care of it, and that would take care of itself, and it didn't happen. So now he goes public. He makes an executive order. Okay, if he was alive today, he'd put it on Twitter, right? Every male boy, you are to throw into the Nile River. Let's get rid of them. Okay, so now everybody knows about it. It's hard to hide the fact that if you have a boy that is born. So these are tough times. The Nile was really what made Egypt, right? If there was no Nile, there's no Egypt. That's where they got the water for everything, and it's a delta, so everything is based around the Nile. So this would have been convenient for them just to throw the babies in, and then the Nile is connected to the gods, and so Pharaoh could blame the gods for what was going on. So imagine being with child as a mother, or being a father, waiting for the child, 9 months. There's 9 months of misery, isn't it? There's no baby showers. There's no registering at Toys R Us, right? Your husband's down in the mud and dealing with this stuff, and you may be in the mud for a while, and you are just dreading what's going to come because there's no way to tell if it's a boy or girl. And so maybe they're praying that every child they have is going to be a girl. And so you have a boy, and just imagine that feeling that somebody finds out, and then people tell, and they get word back to the officials in the middle of the night. They knock your door down, and they come, and they take your baby. They throw the baby in the water to get rid of it. Imagine that. That's just awful. And these are the people of God, right? It's just awful stuff. So just think about how they felt. They felt defeated. They felt forgotten about. They felt hot and tired and miserable. They felt hopeless. And so they were wondering, where is God? The other day, there was a dump truck, and the dump truck is up in the northeast part of the country. The dump truck turned over, and all these stones came out and landed on top of this lady's car, and she was in the car, and she was totally buried with these stones. Well, thankfully, she was able to get out and be okay. But she was buried under all this stuff. And that's how the Jews were, right? They were buried under all this stuff and overtaken of enslavement and their babies, and it's just an awful situation. And some people in your life, maybe you feel buried with what you're going through. You have a loss in your life, or job, or work, or family, and just so many things going on. You just feel buried, just under so much stuff. Well, we can be faithful, right? We can trust God because He is faithful. You say, how is God faithful here? How is God faithful in all this? All these years He lets them be enslaved. He lets the babies go by. How is God faithful in any of this? Well, if we stopped at chapter 1, and that'd be the end of the story, we could say God might not be faithful, right? Right? I used to love listening to Paul Harvey. What would he say? And now, the rest of the story, right? So thank God there's more to the story, right? Notice in chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw he was beautiful, of course all babies are beautiful, right? No mother says he saw her son's ugly. She hid him for 3 months. But when she couldn't hide him any longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. And then she put the child and set it in among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. So a baby is born. And the command is to throw him into the river. So what does she do? She throws him into the river, right? Eventually, but she has him in the river in a basket. And it's the same word he used of the ark of Noah. As God is sparing the ark, he's sparing Moses. And we always get the idea that she just tossed him in the river and he just kind of floated in the middle of the river, right, in the water real fast. Well, that's not what happened, because if you toss him in the water real fast, he'll go by real fast and take off, and maybe a crocodile would see him. But what does it say? Where does she put him specifically? It says, what does it say? She put the child and set it among the reeds, along the banks of the Nile. So she's not just throwing him in the middle of the river just to go, pew, take off, and hopefully he goes somewhere. She is putting him in a very strategic place in the reeds among the bank, because she knows what's going to happen. She knows what she's doing, and she's a woman of faith. She didn't give up on the faithfulness of God. And let's notice quickly, the last of our verses. Verse 5, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, with her maidens walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. She opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying, and she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." And then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go call for a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, so that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you the wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she named him Moses and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." And so we know the story, right? Moses is spared, and the rest is history. I love what Chuck Swindoll said. He wrote, "Baby Moses opened his eyes to a very different world from our own. Although neither he, his mother, or father knew it, the birth of this man-child launched a series of events that would change the course of the nations and shape the destiny of millions. History would turn on a hinge like that on that birth. The world would never be the same again." You see, God had a plan, right? He was going to deliver his people out of the misery. They may have seemed forgotten, but they weren't forgotten. They may have seemed defeated, but they weren't. They may have seemed hopeless, but there was still hope. The same is true in your life. You may feel defeated. You may feel forgotten. You may feel hopeless, but God is still faithful. Well, there was a Catholic priest, a Methodist preacher, and a Baptist preacher. They all went fishing together in a rowboat in the middle of a pond. And none of them caught anything all morning. I guess that's the typical preacher thing, because I never catch anything. So the Catholic priest said he had to go take care of something. So he climbs out of the boat, walks on water to the shore. He comes back 10 minutes, and he's totally dry. He's fine. So the Baptist preacher decides he has to go do something. He probably went to go get fried chicken, okay, as a good Baptist preacher. He climbs out of the boat. He walks on the water, too, and he comes back in 10 minutes. He's perfectly dry. Well, the Methodist preacher didn't have to go anywhere, but he's so impressed with their faith, and he says, "I can do that, too." And so he stands up, excuses himself, he steps out, makes a big splash down into the water. The Baptist says to the priest and says, "I suppose we should have told him where the rocks are." Right? All right. Some of you didn't get it. That's okay. It's okay. As long as you're listening, right? I thought it was funny. I don't know. Maybe I should have put the Baptist preacher in the water. That's okay. Well, you know, if we doubt the faithfulness of God, there's some rocks we can stand on, right? Well, I want to close. I want to give you some 3 rocks that this passage reminds us of. Three rocks we can stand on when we seem to be sinking down. The faithfulness of God. The first thing we see, we're reminded of, is God is always at work. God is always at work in your life. You may not see God at work. You may not understand. You may not know what he's doing. You may wonder, where are you, God? God is always at work in your life, right? The Israelites didn't know God was at work. He didn't know what was coming, did they, for all those years? But God was doing a great work. And did you catch what God was doing in all this stuff? What happened when the Pharaoh enslaved them? He wanted to wipe them out, to weaken them. What did they do? God only increased their number, right? They got stronger and more multiplied. Well, then he went to the midwives and told them to get rid of the babies, and it didn't work either, did it? They kept being born. And then he told them to throw into the river. And the only one God's going to use was thrown into the river. And who eventually got Moses? Pharaoh's own daughter, right? A princess. So it's amazing that, you think about it, 5 ladies ruined the whole plan of Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh was powerful, more powerful than Donald Trump. Egypt was a superpower for thousands of years, the most powerful man on the face of the earth, and 5 women destroyed his whole plan, right? The 2 midwives, Moses' mom, Moses' sister, and Pharaoh's daughter. Isn't that amazing how God weaved these ladies into the life of the Israelites and everything, and to raise them up? This is a reminder that God is always at work. So God's always at work in your life too, right? The story has not ended. There's a rest of the story. But it's also a reminder that God is drawing you unto Himself. God is drawing you unto Himself. God had a plan, and He was going to free them from bondage, right? And that's what He does. He frees them from bondage, not just so they could be free from Egypt, but so they could do what? Worship Him and be free to serve Him. And that's what Exodus is about. The book means literally to exit out, to go, to leave. And so it's in two parts. The first part is leaving Egypt, getting out of Egypt, getting free. The second part is getting to God, worshiping God. So it's serving Pharaoh and serving God, the two parts of Exodus. It's all about getting free. It's not just a story of their redemption, it's a story of our redemption, right? You see, they were under bondage, they were under a wicked Pharaoh, and if you remember before they went free for the Passover, what did they have to do? They had to do what on their door? Apply the blood on the door, right? You know, you and I are in bondage to sin, and we serve a wicked master. We serve Satan and sin and in bondage, and we can't free ourselves. Guess what? Jesus came and died, right? And we can apply that blood to the doorsteps of our life and to our souls, and we can be free. So it's not just a story of their redemption, it's a story of our redemption as well. God is drawing you to Himself. And the last thing is, God is keeping His promises. God is keeping His promises. Very first verse of Exodus, these are the names of the sons of Israel. These are the ones that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And it seemed like for hundreds of years that God didn't keep His promise, but He did, and He was going to keep His promise. In chapter 3, in verse 6, just some 3 verses here. In chapter 3, verse 6, He said also, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. See that? My people who are in Egypt. And have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I'm aware of their sufferings. So I've come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to land flowing with milk and honey, to a place of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Pezerite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, right? And the termite, all those termites. What was He saying? I'm keeping my promise. I'm keeping my promise. So God is keeping His promises. God may not seem faithful in your life, but He's keeping His promises. And I love His promise. He'll never leave you or forsake you, right? He's promised He's going to give you joy no matter what. He's taking care of us. He's promised that nothing shall separate us from the love of God. He's promised us that He's going to go ahead and turn all things into good and for His glory. So whatever you're going through today, God is at work in your life. God is keeping His promises. And God is drawing you to Himself. I began with a song, Great is Thy Faithfulness. It's one of my favorites. So I want to end with another song, which is one of my 2 babies' favorites, Emma and Chloe. They love a couple songs, but we sing He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. And I love singing that song to them. You know, it says He's got the whole world in His hands, and you sing that. He's got the itty-bitty babies in His hands. He's got you and me, brother, in His hands. So I like to personalize it. So I say, He's got Emma and Chloe in His hands. And we'll sing that. He's got Mama and Daddy. He's got Ainsley and Macy. Macy's the dog. And so we personalize that, right? And they sing it along, so it's great. And so we could personalize this, right? He's got Egypt and Pharaoh in His hands. He's got the Israelites in His hand. I can say He's got you and me in His hands. He's got the whole world in His hands, right? So this book and this passage reminds us that God is large and in charge. And whatever you're going through, God can be faithful. He's got the whole world and your situation in His hands. So trust Him. Let's pray. Father, we thank You for Your word. Lord God, I just thank You for this passage, Lord. I just love Exodus. And Lord, we think of Exodus, we think of Moses, but Exodus is not about Moses. It's about You and Your faithfulness to Your people. And we can experience Your faithfulness every day. And I'm thankful, Lord, that there was a time in my life where I was a slave. I was in bondage to sin. And I served under an oppressor, Satan, and that Jesus set me free. And I had a spiritual exodus in my life. And Lord, You are drawing me to You. And I thank You for each one in here that has had that same experience of being saved and delivered from their sins and delivered from that past and their old way of life. And that whatever we're going through, Lord, You are at work in our lives. We may not understand it. We may not see it. Lord, you're so faithful. And you're drawing us, you're redeeming us and drawing us to yourself. And you are a great promise keeper. So I pray this will be a great encouragement, Lord God, to each one today, that you are still faithful and we can have faith in you, that the God of Exodus, Lord, you are still the same God today. And I pray for those who don't know you, Lord God, who don't understand this being free from sin and free from slavery and bondage, Lord, I pray that you'd help them see Christ, that He is our Redeemer, that He has died and shed His blood so they could be set free, so they can get out of bondage from whatever they're under and enjoy their new life, Lord. So we just thank you. You've got the whole world in your hands, and so we're going to trust you, Lord. It's in your Son's name.